especially to you, Coach Jude. We are the Study Hub number 2.
So good everyone, we are the study hub number 2. And this moment we are going to talk about the learner-centered characteristics and foundation. So before that, let me introduce myself and the rest of my group. I am Carl Haynes Vicentinales. I am the student number 2. And Pinky Gallego is student number 1. Kachapay Cabrahim is student number 3. Reina Feeluna is student number 4. And Danica Dapian is student number 5. So the learners are the core elements in learning and teaching processes. So learners are rational and social beings whose growth and development are um, different from each other. Individual differences, among others, are attributed to genetic learner-centered instructions. It is a paramount of to identify and examine how does a learner learning needs, and from there adapt a classroom pedagogy or sets of instructional strategies that will facilitate them and bring them to their full human potentials. So without further ado, let's start with our first topic that we will be going to discuss by Pinky Gallego.
A pleasant day, everyone, especially to our Prof. Coach Jude Martinez. Allow me first to introduce myself. I'm Pinky Rose Gallego, and today I will be discussing learner-centered teaching and its characteristics. So let us now start by defining or answering the question, what is learner-centered teaching? So I'm sure that you are familiar with this because for sure it was a difficult thing for us students to shift from teacher-centered to learner-centered approach. But in this video, we are going to dig deeper about what learner-centered is. So the first thing that we can across with is that learner-centered teaching is an approach to teaching that focuses on students' learning rather than on the teacher is doing. So, meaning to say, in the teacher-centered teaching, the center or the focus is the teacher. But in the learner-centered teaching, the focus are on the students. Thus, the focus of the activity of the teaching or learning process are the students. Next is student-centered learning puts students' interest first, acknowledging students' voice as central of their learning experience. In a student-centered learning space, students choose what they will learn, how they will pace their learning, and how they will assess their own learning by playing the role of the facilitator of the classroom. So this is in contrast to traditional education, also dubbed teacher-centered learning, which situates the teacher as the primarily active role while students take a more passive receptive role. Another thing is that students are active participants and more engaged in their learning and they make decisions about what they will learn and how. In teacher-centered classroom, teachers choose what the students will learn and how the students will be assessed on their learning. In contrast, student-centered learning requires students to be active, responsible participants in their own learning and with their own pace of learning. Next is learner-centered teaching works in collaboration. Learner-centered teaching encourages students to reflect on what they are learning and how they are learning. With a student-centered classroom, the traditional roles have changed. Students are no longer receiving information but exploring and constructing it. Students work collaboratively to solve problems of the content. So the next thing about learner-centered teaching is that learning is deeper and long-term. Deeper learning emphasizes developing higher-level thinking skills and understanding material being learned. This approach means that students are given more control over the learning process and are encouraged to explore the material in a way that makes sense of them. Deep learning is not just about superficial, like memorization or knowing the definition. It is more than long-term retention. When we say long-term retention, it means that more learners do a certain thing that will be long-term retention. So meaning to say, they can be able to retain the knowledge since they are the ones who get such knowledge. Lastly, in learner-centered perspective, Teachers must continually seek to understand how students learn so that they can effectively apply and adopt teaching strategies to meet the learning needs of their students. It is important for teachers to know how students learn so they can help them in the process of learning. Knowing the students' capacity of learning will help teachers to seek effective way to meet the learning needs of their students. So now let's proceed to the characteristics of a learner-centered teaching. Number one, learner-centered teaching engages students into the hard, messy work of learning. According to the Principles of Learning, one by Horn and Pine 1990, they stated that learning is an experience which occurs inside the learner and is activated by the learner. So therefore, teachers need to engage their students in the teaching-learning process. The role of the teacher will serve as a facilitator that will facilitate the students' active participation and also as a teacher in facilitating learner-centered teaching. Teachers need to provide challenging activities that will enable the students to work hard and have a massive work for them to learn meaningfully. Number two, learner-centered teaching includes explicit skill instruction. So explicit skill instruction is necessary for teachers because teachers tend to serve as models to their students in a sense that they will emulate the positive characteristics that the teacher possesses. And according to the Principles of Learning, it's stated there that learning is a consequence experience. That is why the students must also be engaged with experiencing their own knowledge to be included with the certain process for them to be able to gain skills. Learner-centered teachers teach students how to think, solve problems, evaluate evidence, analyze arguments, generate hypotheses. All those learning skills are essential to mastering material in the discipline. Number three, learner-centered teaching encourages students to reflect on what they are learning and how they are learning it. Again, according to the Principles of Learning by Horn and Pine, it's stated there that learning is a consequence of experience, and learning is the discovery of personal meaning and relevance of ideas. That is why teachers let their students learn by reflecting on what they are doing, so therefore they could be able to modify what they already learned by simply reflecting in which certain part they have mistake and how to improve or change that mistake into a correct one. Number four, learner-centered teaching motivates students by giving them some control over the learning process. According to the learner-centered psychological principles, category 1, it is a cognitive and metacognitive factors. We have the number one factors, the nature of the learning process. The nature of the learning process, it is intentional. So therefore, the students are not forced. They will be the one who will push themselves or have that what we call intrinsic motivation to learn. Learner-centered teaching search out ethically responsible way to share power with students. And lastly, learner-centered teaching encourages collaboration. Learner-centered teachers work to develop structures that promote shared commitments to learning. By working in groups, of course, the students could be able to achieve one of the pillars of education, which is the learning or learning how to live together. So in this way, the student could learn interdependently. Interdependently because we have this old saying, two heads is better than one. And that ends my topic. And now let's proceed to the paradigm shift from teacher-centered to learner-centered teaching that will be reported by Katrafaika Barahim.
A blessed day, study buddies! I am Katja Faika Barahim from Study Hub number 2 and the student number 3 of BSED English 1B. For today's learning video, we will tackle about paradigm shift from teacher-centered to learner-centered teaching. The way we see things has a huge impact in our lives. The shift from teacher-centered to learner-centered teaching facilitates the adoption of new practices that is applicable at present. The teacher's role from being a provider of information to being a facilitator of learning. The shift increases the engagement of students in the learning process and makes the learners more responsible for their own learning. By creating this environment, you increase the motivation of students to remain engaged in the learning process. You also foster independence and allows individual differences, and learning style which conforms to learners' needs. Well, there are two philosophical perspectives. The first one is that teacher-centered philosophist. Essentialism is an American philosophy of education which begins in the 1930s and 1940s, was introduced by William Bagley. The two origins of essentialism are from idealism and realism. It is often called traditionalism and conservatism. It is an educational theory that believes that the purpose of schooling is to impart necessary knowledge, skills, and attitudes to enable young people to function as fully developed human beings in the modern world. Essentialism basically teaches the basic subjects or the core curriculum. The next one is perennialism. Is the most conservative tradition or flexible philosophy. It is largely a product of Aristotle's rationalism and its subsequent treatment by Thomas Aquinas. It assumes that man's basic or essential characteristic is his ability to reason. Only through reason can man understand existence and how he required to live. Perennialists believe that one should teach the things that they believe are of everlasting importance to all individuals everywhere. Educational philosophy suggesting that nature, including human nature, is constant and schools should teach content and topics that have withstood the test of time. Where the second one is the learner-centered philosophies. Progressivism. The proponents of this philosophy are William Kilpatrick and John Dewey. Progressivism emphasizes the concept of progress, which asserts that human beings are capable of improving and perfecting their environment. Progressivists believe that people learn best from what they consider most relevant to their lives. Students learn best when they pursue their own interests, satisfying their needs. In other words, learning by doing, curriculum is built on the needs, experiences, abilities, and the interests of students. The next one is humanism. It's a student-centered philosophy that focuses on the enhancing one's innate goodness, rejects the idea of group-oriented education, and upholds the idea of enhancing individual development. This philosophy also believes that students should be actively involved with their education on all levels, and students should be able to make choices about what they will be learning. The purpose of humanism is to create interest in all spheres of life. Believes learning is viewed as a personal act to fulfill one's potential. Believes in the necessity of studying a person as a whole, particularly as they grow and develop over a lifespan. Constructivism refers to the idea that learners construct knowledge for themselves, and each learner individually and socially construct meaning as he or she learns. It suggests that learners should be active participants in learning activities, that learning should be guided rather than presented by teachers, and that interaction and discussion critically components of the learning process. Learning happens when students combine new and old ideas. However, learning occurs if students are actively engaged. It is also a learning theory that equates learning with creating meaning from experience. For references, we have 5 supporting researches. Number 1 is a qualitative examination of connections between learner-centered teaching and past significant learning experiences by Tim Backenberry of Bowling Green State University in December 10, 2012. Number 2, the role of teaching efficacy and characteristics on teaching effectiveness, performance, and use of learner-centered practices by Carlo Magno from De La Salle University, Manila, in June 1, 2007. Number 3, the impact of learner-centered teaching in students, learning skills and strategies by Maria Angeles, Dario Hinosalango, Amparo, Vedwa Dinagsao, Mindanao University of Science and Technology, Philippines, on International Journal for Cross-Disciplinary Subject in Education, in December 7, 2014. Number 4, student-centered learning in classrooms, a strategy for increasing students' motivation and achievement, by Vaikund Pal and M. Manjula Malia from Department of Information and Technology. Number 5, learner-centered classroom practices and assessments, maximizing student motivation, learning and achievement, by Barbara L. McCombs and Linda Miller.
Good day, everyone. I am your student number 4, Rina Aluna, and today we're going to talk about resistance to change managing shift. So, a learner-centered approach views learners as an active agent. They bring their own knowledge, past experience, education, and idea, and this impacts how they take on board new information to learn. So this approach is differs significantly from a traditional structure-centered approach. So traditional learning approaches were informed by behaviorism, which sees learners as blank states and instructors as the expert who must impart all the relevant informations. This approach sees learners as respondents to external stimuli. Resistance to change in shifting from a teacher-centered approach to a learner-centered approach, one often stems from an educator's familiarity with the traditional methods, fears of losing control, and uncertainty about the new approach. Managing these shifts involves through communication, highlighting benefits, providing training, and involving teachers in the planning process. Recognizing and addressing concerns can help create a more positive and collaborative transition. It is human nature to counteract any changes, but changes is inevitable. The reasons why people resist to change is because it's not an easy transition and there is a fear of the unknown. Students resist learner-centered approach for a variety of reasons. So there are 4 most common reasons students resist learner-centered approach. So today, we are going to tackle what are the 4 common reasons students resist learner approaches. So number 1 reasons for students to resist this approach is that learner-centered approach are more work. This approach are more work for faculty who now face complex instructional design issues. But the students resist because they quickly realize that this means much more work for them as well. Resistance that is based on the increased amount of work is resistance for the right reasons for the teacher's perspective. Switching to learner-centered approach means teachers have to spend more time planning and customizing lessons to fit individual students' needs. Students might resist because they realize it requires them put in more effort too. From a teacher's perspective, resistance based on the increased workload is considered valid because it signifies concerns about the changes being raised for the right reasons. So number 2 reasons is learner-centered approach are more threatening. Students also resist these approaches because they're afraid. The teachers has opened Pandora's box and let out all sorts of unknown and unfamiliar policies, practices, assignments, and expectations not regularly encountered in other classes. The fear becomes a major anxiety for students who face learning-centered tasks without confidence in themselves as a learner. In some students resist says more about self-perceptions than it does about the approach. So basically, learner-centered approaches can be scary for students because it introduces new and unfamiliar things like different rules, tasks, and expectations. This can make them self-anxious about learning in a way they're not used to. And some students resist because they lack of confidence in themselves as learners. So, in essence to that, their resistance is more about how they see themselves as students rather than actual teaching approach. For number three reasons is that learner-centered approach involves losses. So there is a study by class 1994 points out that whenever you move from one level of understanding to another, something is lost. We, as teachers, need to remember that growth creates a sense of loss in students. The loss of certainty that has sustained them and been a refuge in an increasingly complex and confusing world. These approaches take our students to new place where the responsibility and ownership for what does and does not happen is much more obviously theirs. Some students resist is about loss and longing for the simpler way this used to be. They may understand intellectually that the new approach are good for them and foster their personal development, but the feeling of loss is an emotional one that sometimes manifests itself as resistance. So to simplify what I've said, basically when teachers use methods that focus on students taking charge of their learning, it means students have more responsibility. This change can be hard for students because they might miss the old and simpler way of learning. Even if they understand that the new methods are good for their personal growth, the emotional feeling of losing the old ways can make it tough for them to accept and adapt the new learning approach. Lastly, number four reason is that learner-centered approaches may be beyond students. If teachers are unfair to students and unethical to ask students to engage in ethically compromised behavior, then we should hope that students would resist. Despite the past that they may do so at some personal paths, most faculty are not unethical or unfair with students. But the learner-centered approach technique selects me as students to take approaches, complete work, employing methods, or as particular structure that are beyond students' ability to handle. So basically, if teachers treat students unfairly or ask them to do things that are not right, we expect students to resist on doing it. Even if it puts them at personal risk, while most teachers are not unfair, some teaching methods may require students to do things they find difficult or inappropriate, but those methods are just some approaches that they need to take to be able to develop some skills or enhance their learning methods throughout these learner-centered approaches. And now let's move forward to faculty resistance. Students are not the only one who resist these approaches. Some colleagues and administration will object as well. This resistance will be just as disheartening. It might be professionally threatened too. As with students, it is important to analyze the basis of their resistance. On what grounds do they object? Then considered how a faculty member committed to learner-centered approaches and anxious to implement them can deal with resistance at this level. So to simply put this up, not only students but also some teachers and administrators may resist these new teaching methods. Their resistance can be disheartening and might even pose a threat to their professional standing. It's crucial to understand why they object and then figure out how a teachers dedicated to learner-centered approaches can address and handle this resistance from colleagues. Now let's talk about the source of faculty resistance. The objections that colleagues raise came primarily from two sources. They object because they find the approaches enormously threatening. Learner-centered approaches test a teacher's level of self-confidence. They deal with issues of power and authority. They take us away from an exclusive reliance on content, expertise, and move us into a new unfamiliar domain of learning skills. They raise questions about common instructional practices. Some colleagues persist for much more objective reasons. They are connected about they are concerned about what these approaches do, like diminish the amount of content in course, let students set course policies, devote class time to developing learner skills and awareness, employing rules and equipments, and involves students in assessment activities. For many faculty, these are radical ideas and they raise quite legitimate questions about them. This is why it is important for those using these approaches to understand something of the empirical, theoretical, and experimental basis on which they rest. And as with some kind of students' resistance, these are objections for the right reasons. They are questioned. They are questions we can answer, and they provide us opportunities to inform, educate, and move more faculty forward in their thinking about learning and the kind of teaching that promotes it. And now let me discuss to you the strategies in dealing with faculty resistance. Number one is be mindful of the politics. When it says be mindful of the politics, it means when you're dealing with faculty resistance, you should pay attention to how things work in the school. Who has the power and possible disagreements. These strategies recommends being aware of this factor and handling them carefully to work together with faculty and overcome any resistance. Number two is use the autonomy of your classroom. When it says use the autonomy of your classroom, it means you have the freedom to make your own decisions about how will you teach or the strategy you can use to make teaching more interesting and alive, and as well as set up your class. It lets you create your teaching style while still following the main rules of the school. Number four is do not seek to convert the masses. When it says do not seek to convert the masses, it means you don't have to convince everyone to agree with you when facing resistance from faculty. Instead, focus on getting support from key people or smaller groups who are important. Understanding that not everyone may agree with your approach, it's about building the target support rather than trying to win over everyone. Number four is document the impact of your approaches. So when it says document the impact of your approaches, it means you should keep track on how your teaching methods make a positive difference in the classroom by having evidence of the good result like improved learning or outcomes. You can show others that your way works well. This documentation can be useful in addressing unconcerns or resistance from other faculty members. And lastly, number five, find like-minded colleagues. When it says find like-minded colleagues, it means it's helpful to connect with other teachers who think similarly to you when facing resistance from faculty. By learning up with people who share their views or goals, you can support each other, understand common challenges, and work together to overcome issues in the academic environment. So Weimer M 2002 states that students and faculty resistance will keep us honest about what we are doing and why. It helps to see it positively and Rob that reminds us to continue exploring the theory and research, as well as their experiences of colleagues. Many of us will tell you that students resist fades and is then gone well before that of colleagues. Lots could be said of that, but the net effect is that once students are on board, there really is no turning back. They will move you forward despite the objections and resistance of some colleagues. And that's all for my topic on resistant to change managing the shift. Now let's proceed to student number 5, Ms. Anika Dapian, to discuss the next topic.
So good afternoon everyone, my name is Anika Dapian and for today I'm going to discuss to you the dimension learner-centered teaching. So in dimension, we have 5 practices, which are the function for content, the role of instructor who should take the responsibility, the purposes and process of assessment, and lastly, the balance of power. But first, I'm going to discuss to you the functions for content. So what is function of content? So, according to Weimer 2002, there are 5 practices or dimensions that need to change to achieve learner-centered teaching. First is the function of content. In addition to building a knowledge base, the content facilitates students to build an appreciation for value of content, build discipline-specific learning methodologies, practice using inquiry or ways of thinking in the discipline, and learn to solve real problems. Students engage in most of the content to make in their own. Students make meaning out of the content. Content can help students develop an organized framework or way to learn in this. Content is framed so that students see how it can be applied in the future. So number 2 is the role of the instructor. The instructor creates an environment that fosters student learning, accommodates different learning styles, implicitly aligns objective teaching methods and assessment consistently, utilize multiple teaching techniques appropriate for student learning goals, design activities in which students interact with the material, the teacher, and each other, motivate students to learn intrinsically. Number 3 is who should take responsibility for learning. So the student should take responsibility. Often it is the faculty who does because we adapt our teaching to fit requests, needs of the student through detailed notes, study guides. So consequences of faculty taking responsibility for learning. The student remain passive. The student do not gain confidence in their ability to learn on their own. Yet, a common goal of higher education is for graduates to be self-directed learners who can continue to learn the rest of their lives. Faculty need to teach students how to take responsibility for learning. There are specific skills that can be taught, practiced, and mastered. Number 4 is the purposes and process of assessment. Assessment is integrated within the learning process. Instructors give formative feedback for the purposes of fostering improvement. Students have multiple opportunities to assess themselves and their peers. The student can learn from their mistake and then demonstrate mastery. Instructors encourage students to justify their answer when they do not agree with those of instructor. Instructor and student mutually agree on a time frame for feedback and also always follow the time frame for providing feedback. Instructor uses authentic assessment throughout the courses. And lastly, for number 5, we report by Mr. Centenales, and that's all for my part.
We're going to talk about the balance of the power. So what is the balance of the power? So learner-centered approaches empower students to take responsibility, to share, and to share of their some of decisions about their courses. So in the students has parts when it comes to decision making. to their courses or to their learning processes. Practically, this means allowing them to make more decisions about assignments, policies, course consents, and even evaluations. To be blunt, that's just a sounds of threatening to most of us. Loss of powers in the classrooms might mean loss of control or a worse. According to an article by Marilyn Weimer, a book review of learning-centered teaching, she stated that the power is just one sided of a coin. The other side is responsibility. So students and teachers cannot have one without the other. Yes, so once students begin to gain some control or also share their power or balance of the power inside the classrooms, they will engage more and the course will be more interesting in on their end. So once a student begin to gain some control over the course, they will engage more in the courses and will learn more. So before we formally end our presentations, let me give you a summary. So in summary, learner-centered teaching is an approach to teaching that focuses on the student's learning rather than on what the teacher is doing. Students choose what they will learn, how they will pace their learning, and how they will assess their own learning by playing the role of their facilitator of the classroom. On the other hand, teacher-centered teaching, the focus is on the students. Teachers choose what the students will learn and how the students will be assessed on their learning. So, according to Principles of Learning by Home and Pine 1990, they stated that the learning is an experience which occurs inside the learners and activated by the learner. The role of the teacher will serve as a facilitator that will only facilitate the students' learning and active participations. Teachers need to provide challenging activities that will enable the students to work hard and have even a massive work for them to learn meaningfully. Moreover, the shift from teacher-centered of learner-centered teachings increases the students' engagements of the students in the learning processes and makes learners more responsible for their own learning. In learner-centered, the role of the teachers is only to facilitate and guide the students towards the learning processes. So the students will help themselves to engage in the processes of learning in learner-centered teaching. So that's it for the summary. So now, after I give you the summary, let's now talk about the conclusion. So, therefore, we conclude that the learner-centered teaching approaches emphasizes that there are different ways or how learners will adopt the teaching approach through the concepts of characteristics and foundations. So, just like what we talked earlier, the different topics of the assigned students regarding on the characteristics and foundations of the learner-centered approach. So, the learners will adopt the teaching approach through the concepts of characteristics and foundations of the learner-centered teaching. Learner-centered teaching pedagogy creates an environment that speaks to the hearts of the learning. It encourages the students to deeply engage with the material, develop a dialogue, and reflect to their progress. It represents a shift away from the sage on the stage. So mentality and puts the students' learning at the center stage. As a students gain greater access to information, it is the educator roles to guide the applications and assimilations of that information into real world problems, just like what our teachers doing. They assess us to make us realize what we learn and what we gain progress to ourselves. So the foundations of the learner-centered teaching is rooted a constructive framework of learning theory. Constructivists postulate that humans are interpreters who construct meaning from new and to prior experiences. Instructional design should therefore focus on providing tools and environments for helping learners interpret the multiple perspectives of the world, creating their own world. So, It is said that the students help themselves to make them realize and make themselves feel on the real world. So that's it for the conclusion. So um, last part we will going to talk about the takeaway. So now we are on the last part of our presentations, which is the takeaway, or we presenters will give you a takeaway so that you will have a at least knowledge gained from us. So during the presentations, we have learned a lot from the learner-centered teaching approach, the characteristics and the foundations of it, including the topics were presented by the presenters earlier, the characteristics of learner-centered teaching, paradigm shifts from the teacher and to learner-centered teaching, resistance to change, managing shift, dimension of the learner-centered teachings, and lastly, the balance of the power. So we hope that we apply it to ourselves upon ending these presentations with takeaway. And always remember that the future belongs to those who believes in the beauty of their dreams. That quote is from Eleanor Roosevelt. So thank you for watching.